Chair. And Secretary, it's good to have you here. I'd like to just follow up on the discussion you had with Senator Reid for a brief moment. You and I have talked about this before, but every member in this committee and every senator here has actually supported a piece of legislation that's essentially a fast-track permitting process for chip fabrication facilities here in America. It takes roughly a 5-year program, 5-year permitting process down to about 18 months. So I would encourage and appreciate any help from the department as well, getting support in the House to move this through. I think it fits right in line with what you're talking about from a strategic standpoint. Yes,
I'd be happy to work with you on that. It is an issue. I mean, these facilities, permitting often holds them up for 1-2 years at a time.
I think we're very aligned on that. I'd like to turn just a minute to talk about the Census, excuse me. It's a function that's required by the Constitution. In looking at the 2020 census, there are a lot of questions about the statistical methods and the assumptions that are used to supplement the actual data that's collected. There are methods like group quarters imputation or differential privacy that are employed. I'm not sure if you're familiar with these methodologies.
Somewhat. I mean, obviously, I am not a statistician, but somewhat.
Yeah, I'm like you, somewhat familiar with. I understand the principles of them, but it seems to me that the employees at the Department of the Census are really the only ones that fully understand and appreciate the assumptions, the models, what goes into them, and they're the ones that are actually charged with looking at the actual numbers, making adjustments, changing the numbers, and coming up with the final report. I just feel the American public, certainly the Congress, would be well served to have a little more oversight and more visibility into what those methods are and how they're being deployed. And I wanted to bring this up to you, if you could be supportive of perhaps putting in place a bipartisan panel that would overlook the way the census is conducted, the methodologies. Again, this should be a nonpartisan issue, I think, for us, and a bipartisan panel has been done before. It strikes me this may be a way to get some more transparency and oversight in place.
You know, this is the first I'm hearing of it, but I'm open to following up with you. What I can tell you is I have set the tone at the top of the Commerce Department that the Census Bureau should be fact-based, data-based, science-based, statistical-based. And Rob Santos, who is the new census head, has a strong statistical background. And I believe that, I feel confident that that is the way he is running the department. Having said that, more transparency is always better.
I'll provide a few more questions for the record on that, but I look forward to working with you in that regard. And I appreciate the chair's perhaps having an oversight meeting soon about what the census is doing. It'd be great to get that on our agenda. The next place I'd like to turn has to do with our competitiveness in the Indo-Pacific, and I know you've spent a good deal of time on that. Our economic leadership in that region, I think, is terribly important for our national security interest. It's important for good jobs here in America. As a former governor, you appreciate that, I'm certain, very much. I just led a bipartisan delegation to Japan a couple of weeks ago, worked very closely with my successor, Ambassador Rahm Emanuel. We visited with the Prime Minister, with his cabinet, with a number of business leaders. And in all of those meetings, it was clear to me that it's as important as ever that we continue to find ways to deepen our economic ties in the region, particularly given what's happening with the Chinese Communist Party, their aggressive posture, whether it be from a diplomatic standpoint, a military standpoint, and certainly from an economic standpoint. We see the Chinese Communist Party moving in every direction in that region. Also, when I served as ambassador, prior to Ambassador Emanuel, I worked very hard to put in place a trade agreement between the United States and Japan that helped deepen our agricultural ties, helped deepen our industrial ties, and importantly, it had an element in it of digital trade, a high-standard digital trade component to it that I think could serve as a model for the broader region. And I would look forward to working with you on that to get your thoughts on how that might be rolled out. I've discussed this with Ambassador Emanuel, and I think it holds some real promise. My first question for you specifically is, under the aegis of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that's been discussed heavily, and I think it will be discussed much more as President Biden visits the region, what are your plans to advance our economic leadership in the region?
Yeah. So a few things. One, I agree with everything you've said, and I'd be happy to follow up. I have already been to Tokyo once. The president will be there next week. We can't do enough to shore up our economic presence in the region. The good news is, by the way, Emmanuel Rahm has me on speed dial. We talk several times a week. We are digital, supply chain, aligning on export controls, investments. There's a lot there. There's a lot there. If you think about semiconductor export controls, there's only 3 countries that have tool makers, the U.S., Japan, and the Netherlands. So if we could align on that, it could be incredible. I'm one of the co-leads, along with Ambassador Tai, on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. In fact, I met this morning with the Prime Minister of Vietnam to get them on board. I hosted Minister Hagerty last week because he's my counterpart, and we're kicking off an economic dialogue as between our Commerce Department and METI. So, time doesn't permit here, but suffice it to say, this is a top priority of mine. I share your prioritization and, frankly, your concern. We need an economic strategy there, but frankly, we also need to be a counterweight to China.
Indeed. And I think there's great potential. I've watched with great interest what you're doing with the US-EU Technology Council. I would encourage you to look at Japan perhaps as a way to continue to find means of agreement and cooperation there. And if there are any things that you need from this committee to support that, please let us know.
Great.
Thank you, Secretary. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I want to just make sure we have a meeting of the minds on this